The day Serena told me I didn't understand money, she said it in front of everyone. The family meeting had been her idea. She'd arranged the chairs herself, pulled them into a half circle in the living room like a classroom, except I was the only student. Philip sat to her left, hands folded, eyes directed somewhere between the floor and his own knees. Gerald Tran sat to her right in a pressed gray shirt, his briefcase open on his lap, papers fanned across the top like he'd come prepared for an audit. 3 of Serena's friends from the neighborhood association had been invited as well. She called them witnesses, though she used a softer word, supporters. I sat across from all of them in my late husband's chair. The fabric had worn thin at the armrests. I hadn't replaced it. I didn't intend to. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The light coming through the front window was flat and pale, the kind that makes everyone look tired. Incense from the altar in the back room drifted through the hallway sandalwood, the same brand I had burned every day for 11 years since my husband Hoa passed. The smell reached me even here. It always did. Serena stood near the window. She was wearing a cream blazer, the expensive kind with structured shoulders, the kind meant to communicate authority before a word is spoken. She had printed documents. She had a highlighted pen. She had everything except the right to any of it. She was explaining, she said, the new administrative structure of the Bui Family Education Foundation. I listened. I had been listening for 18 months. She talked about overhead. She talked about operational efficiency. She talked about the complexity of managing a nonprofit in today's environment, the fees, the compliance costs, the need for professional guidance. Gerald nodded at the appropriate moments. Philip turned a pen over and over between his fingers. Then she reached across and slid a sheet of paper toward me. It was an amendment, a revision to the foundation's original disbursement terms. She wanted my signature. I looked at the paper. I looked at her. I did not reach for the pen. That was when she said it. You don't even understand how foundations work. Her voice was patient in the way that is not patient at all. Just sign where I tell you, and let the adults handle the money. The room went very quiet. One of her friends from the neighborhood association made a small sound. Not agreement, not objection, just the involuntary noise a person makes when something uncomfortable has been said aloud in a small space. Gerald studied his papers. Philip stopped turning his pen. I looked at my daughter-in-law. She was 38 years old. She had a business degree from a university in Hanoi, and a confidence that she wore the same way she wore that blazer, as though it had been tailored for her specifically, as though no one else had a right to it. She believed, genuinely believed, that she was the most capable person in any room she entered. She was not wrong about most rooms. She was wrong about this one. I smiled. A small smile. The kind that doesn't reach the eyes because it isn't meant to, it's meant only to occupy the mouth while the mind does its work. I set the paper back on the table without signing it. Thank you, Serena, I said. I'll think about it. She blinked. She had not expected that. She had expected either compliance or argument, and I had given her neither. The meeting ended shortly after. There was tea I had prepared beforehand. I always prepared tea, even for meetings I had not been consulted about, and people drank it standing, in the way people do when they're not sure whether to stay or go. Gerald left first, briefcase snapped shut. A quick nod in my direction that managed to be both apologetic and evasive. Serena's friends followed, their goodbyes too bright, too cheerful. Philip lingered by the door. Mother, he said. He didn't finish the sentence. Drive carefully, I told him. After they left, I sat alone in the living room for a long time. The flat October light had shifted to something dimmer, more orange, the sun dropping behind the houses across the street. The incense smell was stronger now, or perhaps I was simply more aware of it. Sandalwood and old wood, and the particular silence that fills a house after people have left it. I thought about the paper she'd wanted me to sign. I thought about the original document, the one I had written by hand before any lawyer touched it, the one with the language I had chosen myself, word by word, late at night at the kitchen table, while Hoa's photograph watched from the altar shelf, the one that said clearly, without ambiguity, without any room for creative interpretation, that every dollar in that foundation existed for one purpose, and one purpose only: Daniel's education, tuition, books, academic fees, nothing else, nothing wider, Nothing that could be stretched into overhead or operational efficiency or professional guidance. I had kept a copy of that document in the second drawer of my desk, inside a blue folder with a rubber band around it. I had kept it there for 4 years. I had never mentioned it to anyone. I thought about the 18 months of statements I had requested, one by one, from the Foundation's bank quietly, as the founder, which was my right, though no one had thought to inform me of that right, and I had simply looked it up myself. I thought about the numbers I had written into my old mathematics notebook, the one with the green cover I'd used since my last year of teaching, the columns I had drawn with a ruler because straight lines help you see clearly, deposits on the left, disbursements on the right, Daniel's actual university invoices, which he had emailed to me not knowing why I'd asked, in the middle column. The gap between what had gone out of the foundation and what had reached Daniel's school was not small. It was $40,000 and some change. I reached over and turned on the lamp beside Koa's chair. The room filled with warm yellow light, the altar at the end of the hallway suddenly visible, the incense stick nearly burned down to nothing, a thin curl of smoke still rising. My husband used to say that still water gives no warning before it moves. I had been still for a very long time. Koa and I bought this house in 1987. It was smaller then, or perhaps we were younger, and everything felt larger by comparison. 2 rooms in the back, a kitchen that faced the alley, a front room with windows that rattled when the wind came through from the north. The neighborhood was loud in those years. Children everywhere, vendors calling from the street, the smell of grilled meat and exhaust drifting in through the screens all summer long. We didn't mind. We were 29 years old, and we believed that noise meant life. We painted the walls ourselves. Koa did the trim, careful and slow, the way he did everything. He was a quiet man, an engineer by training and by temperament, the kind of person who measures twice not because he doubts himself but because precision was how he showed love. I did the upper portions, standing on a step stool while he held the base, his hand resting against the wood without being asked. He did that automatically. He always knew when something needed steadying. We taught in the same district for 22 years. He taught physics, I taught mathematics. We rode to school together on the same motorbike for the first decade, until the school assigned him a different building across the city and we had to drive separately. I remember the first morning I left without him. It was February, cold and foggy, and the ride felt longer than it was. Our son Philip was born in 1990. He was a serious child, dark-eyed and watchful, the kind of boy who listened more than he spoke. He took after his father in that. He was good at mathematics, better than I admitted to him at the time. I believed that praise given too easily becomes expectation, and expectation becomes pressure, and pressure is a poor substitute for genuine love of the subject. Now, I wonder sometimes if I was too restrained. If there were things I should have said more plainly, earlier, while there was still time for them to land correctly. But those are thoughts for quiet evenings, and I have many of those now. Koa retired first, 2009, a Thursday in March, with a small ceremony in the school courtyard that he found embarrassing and I found deeply moving. I stayed on for 3 more years, partly because I was not ready, partly because the school needed someone to teach the advanced course, and I was the only one who could. I have never been good at leaving things unfinished. When I finally retired, in 2012, I came home to find that Koa had rearranged the front room. He'd moved the desk to face the window instead of the wall. He said I'd spent 30 years staring at walls, and it was time I looked at something else. He'd also put a small vase of marigolds on the corner of the desk, orange and yellow, the kind sold by the women outside the market every morning. I sat down at that desk and looked out at the street and felt, for the first time in years, completely unhurried. We had 11 months like that. 11 months of mornings without alarm clocks, of slow breakfasts, of walking to the market together, of him reading in the front room while I graded nothing because there was nothing left to grade. 11 months of being 2 people in a house that finally had time to hold us properly. He died in January 2013, a stroke, sudden, on a Sunday morning while he was making tea. I was in the back room. I heard the cup fall. I will not write more about that morning than this. He did not suffer, and I was with him, and the tea had already been poured and was still warm when everything ended. Some griefs are private not because they are too large to share but because sharing them changes their shape. and the shape of mine is the only thing I have left that is exactly as it was. After the funeral, I rearranged the house again. I moved the altar to the hallway between the kitchen and the back room, where the light hits it differently depending on the hour, golden in the morning, dim and blue by evening. I placed his photograph in the center, the one from our last school's reunion where he is laughing at something someone said just before the shutter clicked. He is not looking at the camera. He rarely looked at cameras. He was always looking at something else. Something worth looking at. I burn incense every morning. Sandalwood. He didn't have a preference, but I do, and now the choice is mine. Daniel was born in 2004, Philip's only son, and from the beginning he was a different kind of child than his father. Loud where Philip was quiet, curious where Philip was careful, full of opinions about everything and happy to share them at length. He reminded me of myself at that age, before 30 years of classrooms taught me that most thoughts are better examined before being spoken. I adored him. When Daniel was 14, he told me he wanted to study architecture, not because someone suggested it, not because it was practical, because he had seen a photograph in a magazine of a building in Barcelona and decided, on the spot, that he wanted to understand how something like that was possible. I recognized that feeling. It's the feeling that makes a person a real student, not just a capable one. It was Koa's idea, or rather, it was the idea I had while sitting at the desk facing the window where Koa had placed it. I would establish a foundation, small, structured, accountable. The money I had saved over 40 years of teaching, careful and steady, the same way Koa did trim work. Every dollar directed at Daniel's education, his tuition, his books, whatever he needed to learn the things he wanted to learn. I had a lawyer draw up the documents. I reviewed every sentence. I signed my name at the bottom in the same handwriting I used to write equations on a blackboard, clear, deliberate, no flourishes. That was 4 years ago. I did not know, when I signed those papers, that I had also set something else in motion. That a foundation built quietly, out of love, in a house that still smelled of another person's presence, could become the thing someone else looked at and saw only numbers. I did not know it then. By the time Serena walked into that living room with her highlighted pen and her structured blazer and her patient voice that was not patient, I had been knowing it for quite a while. The bank statement arrived on a Wednesday. This was not unusual. I had requested statements quarterly since the foundation was established, a habit I formed without thinking about it. 30 years of teaching mathematics had given me a particular relationship with numbers, which is to say I did not trust anyone else's summary of them. I wanted the original figures. I wanted to see them myself. What was unusual was that this statement came to the house. For the first 2 years, all foundation correspondence had gone to Gerald Tran's office address. That was the arrangement Serena had proposed when she first suggested bringing in a professional director, and I had agreed to it at the time because the foundation was new and I was still learning its administrative rhythms. I had not thought to question it. I had simply noted it in my green notebook and moved on. But this statement, the one that arrived on a Wednesday in April, in a plain white envelope with the bank's logo in the upper left corner, had my home address printed on it. Someone had made a change and then, apparently, forgotten to fully implement it. Or perhaps not forgotten. Perhaps the change had been made in error, a transposition of addresses during some routine update, and no one had noticed. I noticed. I opened the envelope at the kitchen table with my reading glasses on and a cup of tea going cold beside me. The altar was visible through the doorway. The morning light was coming in at a low angle, striping the floor in pale gold. I looked at the numbers. The foundation had received 3 donations in the previous quarter. 2 from former colleagues of mine, retired teachers who had heard about the fund through the school's alumni newsletter and wanted to contribute. 1 from a former student, a woman now in her 40s, who had tracked me down through a mutual acquaintance and sent a check with a note that said simply, "You taught me how to think, I want to pay that forward." The total incoming was 4,200,000 Vietnamese dong. Approximately $168 by the current exchange. A modest sum but meaningful in the way that modest sums from careful people always are. I looked at the disbursements. There were 2. The first was a transfer to Daniel's university, the correct amount for his second semester tuition. I had already seen this charge on his enrollment confirmation, which he had forwarded to me in February at my request. The numbers matched. I made a small checkmark in my notebook. The second disbursement was listed as administrative and operational expenses. The amount was 3,800,000 dong. I set down my pen. I looked at the figure again. Not because I had misread it. I do not misread numbers. I looked at it again because I wanted to be certain I understood what I was looking at before I decided what to think about it. 3,800,000 against incoming donations of 4,200,000 in a single quarter. I turned to the back of the statement where the balance history was printed. I looked at the previous quarters, the ones I had not seen directly because the statements had been going to Gerald's office. The pattern, once visible, was not subtle. Every quarter for the past year and a half, there had been a disbursement categorized as administrative and operational expenses. The amounts varied, some quarters lower, some higher, but they were consistent in one respect. They were always larger than any single payment to Daniel's university. I got up from the table and went to the back room where I kept my files. In the second drawer of my desk, inside the blue folder with the rubber band around it, was the original foundation charter. I had not opened this folder in nearly 2 years. The rubber band had gone dry and brittle. It snapped when I removed it. I found the disbursement clause on the third page. The language was clear. I had written it to be clear. All funds disbursed from the Bowie Family Education Foundation shall be directed exclusively toward the direct educational expenses of the designated beneficiary, including tuition, required course materials, and academic fees as documented by the receiving institution. No funds shall be disbursed for administrative, operational, or consulting purposes without prior written approval from the founding donor. Prior written approval. I had never given prior written approval for anything described as administrative and operational expenses. I had never been asked for it. I had never seen a request, never received a letter, never been consulted by telephone or in person about any disbursement outside of Daniel's tuition. I sat with that for a while. Outside, the street was going about its morning. A vendor called something I couldn't make out. A motorbike stopped and started. A neighbor's radio played a few bars of something old and familiar before fading again. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary Wednesday. Inside, I was doing arithmetic. 18 months. 6 quarterly statements I had not seen. 6 quarters of administrative and operational expenses at amounts I could not verify, for purposes I had not approved, drawn from a fund I had built with 40 years of careful saving. I did not call Philip that morning. I did not call Serena. I did not call Gerald. I went to the market instead. I bought vegetables for dinner. I bought a new stick of incense, sandalwood. I came home and put the vegetables in the refrigerator and lit the incense at the altar and stood there for a moment looking at Koa's photograph. Then I came back to the kitchen table, opened my green notebook to a fresh page, and drew 2 columns with a ruler. On the left, what had come in. On the right, what had gone out. In the middle, a 3rd column I labeled, what reached Daniel. I had Daniel's university invoices, all of them, because I had asked for copies from the beginning, framing it as a grandmother's interest in his progress. He had sent them without question, semester by semester, neatly scanned and emailed with short, cheerful notes about his classes. I began to fill in the middle column first. The numbers were exact. Daniel's school was precise in its billing. When I had finished the middle column, I turned to the right side and wrote in what the foundation statements showed had been disbursed. The difference revealed itself slowly, the way errors always do when you are patient enough to let the columns speak. By the time I finished, my tea was completely cold, and the incense had burned halfway down, and the number in my notebook was sitting there on the page. Perfectly legible, waiting to be understood. $40,000, American. Converted from the total disbursed across 18 months that had not reached Daniel's university, had not been approved by me, and had no documentation I had ever been shown. I closed the notebook. I put the ruler back in the drawer where it belonged, and I thought about Serena's face in the living room 3 weeks earlier, patient and certain, sliding that amendment across the table toward me, not asking, not explaining, simply moving the paper in my direction as though the signing were a formality, as though the outcome had already been decided, as though I were the kind of woman who did not keep records. I called Daniel on a Thursday evening, which was not unusual. I called him most Thursdays. We talked about his coursework, about his professors, about the buildings he was studying, their proportions, their materials, the logic of their construction. He had strong opinions about concrete. He found glass curtain walls aesthetically lazy. These conversations were the best part of my week. That Thursday, I called him a little earlier than usual. 4 o'clock instead of 7. He answered on the second ring, slightly breathless, just back from a studio session. I could hear the sound of the city behind him, traffic and wind, the particular echo of an outdoor stairwell. I asked about his semester. He told me about a project, a residential design for a narrow urban lot, the challenge of maximizing light without sacrificing privacy. He was excited in the way he always was when a problem interested him. I listened, asked questions, let him run. Then, carefully, I mentioned the foundation. I told him I was reviewing some administrative paperwork and wanted to confirm a few figures. I kept my voice the way I kept my face at the family meeting, pleasant, unhurried, giving nothing away. I asked him what his total tuition and fees had been for the previous academic year. He told me without hesitating. He had the number memorized, the way students memorize things that cost them sleep. It was, he said, a substantial amount. His scholarships covered a portion. The foundation covered the rest. I wrote the number in my green notebook. Then I asked about the semester before that. He gave me that number too, slightly lower because he had taken fewer credits in his first semester. He added, almost as an afterthought, that the payments had always come on time, that whatever Aunt Serena was doing with the administrative side of things, she was at least punctual. He'd give her that. Aunt Serena. I made no sound. I wrote the phrase in the margin of my notebook, not the words themselves, but a small mark I use when something requires returning to. I thanked him. I said I was glad the process had been smooth. I asked about his concrete opinions and let him talk for another 20 minutes about load-bearing structures before we said goodnight. After the call, I sat at the kitchen table and added Daniel's confirmed figures to my middle column. The gap did not change. If anything, it sharpened. Because now I had his numbers from his own mouth. Not from any documents Serena or Gerald had handled, not filtered through any administrative layer. Just Daniel, standing in a stairwell, telling his grandmother what he actually paid. The difference between what he paid and what the foundation had disbursed over those same periods was not a rounding error. It was not a timing discrepancy. It was a pattern, and it was large, and it had been running for a year and a half without anyone mentioning it to me. The next morning, I called Arthur Kim. Arthur was a nonprofit attorney I had found through the school's Retired Faculty Association 3 years earlier, when I first began setting up the foundation. He was methodical, soft-spoken, the kind of lawyer who reads every sentence before moving to the next one. I had liked him immediately. I had also, without making a particular decision about it, never mentioned his name to Serena. I told him I had received a bank statement and wanted to understand the foundation's disbursement history more fully. I did not tell him what I had found. Not yet. I asked what records I was entitled to request as the founding donor. He told me I was entitled to everything. All disbursement records, all banking statements, all board minutes, all contracts with any paid consultants or directors. The foundation existed because of my initial gift. My name was on the charter. My rights were not secondary to anyone else's administrative arrangements, regardless of what those arrangements had come to look like in practice. I thanked him and said I would be in touch. That afternoon, I wrote a formal letter. I used the good paper, the cream-colored stock I kept in the bottom desk drawer for correspondence that needed to look like what it was. I addressed it to Gerald Tran, Director, Bowie Family Education Foundation. I requested, as founding donor, a complete accounting of all disbursements made in the previous 24 months, including payee names, dates, amounts, and supporting documentation for each transaction. I requested the records be provided within 14 days. I signed it with my full name, the same signature that appeared on the original charter. I made a copy. I put the copy in the blue folder. I mailed the original by registered post. Then I waited. Gerald's response came on the 11th day. A single page, printed on foundation letterhead that I did not recognize. The logo had changed slightly. The font different from the original documents I had. The letter thanked me for my continued interest in the foundation and assured me that all disbursements had been made in accordance with the foundation's current operational guidelines. Current operational guidelines. I read the phrase 3 times. I went back to the charter in the blue folder. I read the disbursement clause again, exclusively toward the direct educational expenses of the designated beneficiary. That was the language I had chosen. That was what I had signed. I looked at Gerald's letter again. Current operational guidelines. Not the original charter. Not the founding documents. Something else? Something current? Something I had not written and had not seen. I called Arthur Kim the same afternoon and read him both documents over the phone. He was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he asked me a question I had been waiting for someone to ask. He said, "Mrs. Bowie, has anyone presented you with an amended version of the Foundation's governing documents?" I thought about the family meeting, the living room arranged like a classroom, Serena's highlighted pen, the paper she had slid across the table toward me with the patient voice and the structured blazer, "Sign where I tell you, and let the adults handle the money." I had not signed it. But when Arthur asked his next question whether I was certain no amendments had been filed with the state registry without my signature, the answer I gave him was yes. I was certain. What I did not yet know, what I would not know until 3 days later when Arthur's assistant pulled the state nonprofit registry and sent me a scan of what she found there, was that my certainty was only as good as what I had been allowed to see. The document on file with the state was 4 pages long. The one I had signed was 3. Arthur's assistant sent the scan on a Tuesday morning. I was at the kitchen table when my phone chimed. I had been eating breakfast rice porridge, the plain kind I make for myself on slow mornings, with a little ginger and salt. I set down my spoon, put on my reading glasses, and opened the attachment. The document was titled, Amended Governing Charter Bowie Family Education Foundation, revision date, March 15th, filed with the state nonprofit registry. March 15th was 7 months ago. I had been sitting in this kitchen 7 months ago. I had been burning incense and calling Daniel on Thursdays and tending to the altar and doing all the ordinary things a woman does in her own house. And on March 15th, while I was doing those things, someone had filed an amended charter with the state registry in the name of a foundation that existed because I had built it. My name appeared on the first page. In the section listing the founding donor, it appeared nowhere else. The signature on the final page belonged to Gerald Tran. Directors of nonprofit foundations in this jurisdiction have certain administrative authority, Arthur explained when I called him 20 minutes later. Depending on the original charter language, a director may be empowered to file operational amendments without donor approval, provided those amendments do not alter the fundamental charitable purpose of the organization. I asked him what the amended charter said. He told me to look at page 3, the disbursement clause. In my original document, the clause was 11 lines long. I had written it carefully, with Arthur's guidance, to be specific enough that no one could misread it. Direct educational expenses. Designated beneficiary. Documented by the receiving institution. No administrative or consulting disbursements without prior written approval from the founding donor. The amended version was 4 lines long. It read, "Funds may be disbursed for educational support purposes and related operational expenses as determined by the foundation director in consultation with the administrative committee. Educational support purposes. Related operational expenses. As determined by the foundation director." I read it twice. Then I put the phone down on the table and looked out the window. The street was ordinary. A woman walking with groceries, 2 boys on bicycles, the vendor who sells banh mi from a cart every morning, calling out in his particular rhythm, the same call I had heard from this window for 15 years. I picked the phone back up. Arthur was still there. I asked him whether this amendment was legally valid, whether Gerald had the authority to file it. He said it depended on the original charter's director clause. He asked me to read him the relevant section from my copy. I went to the blue folder, page 2, paragraph 4. The director shall have authority to manage day-to-day operational matters of the foundation. Significant amendments to the foundation's governing documents, including but not limited to disbursement terms, beneficiary designations, or dissolution procedures, shall require written consent of the founding donor. Significant amendments to disbursement terms shall require written consent of the founding donor. Arthur was quiet for a moment after I read it. Then he said, in the careful tone of a man choosing his words precisely, "Mrs. Bowie, What Gerald Tran filed with the state registry was not within his authority under your original charter. The amendment to the disbursement clause is a significant change to the governing terms. It required your written consent. You did not provide it. That means the filed amendment is, at minimum, unauthorized and potentially fraudulent. Fraudule. I had not used that word yet, not even in my own mind. I had been using other words. Irregular. Inconsistent. Unauthorized. I had been keeping the larger word at a careful distance, the way you keep a fire at a careful distance, because once you acknowledge what it is, you have to decide what to do about it. I wrote it in my green notebook. Fraudulent. Below it I wrote Gerald Tran's name. Then, after a moment, I wrote a second name, because here was what I had not told Arthur yet. What I was still assembling while he spoke, the amendment listed an administrative committee with authority to consult on disbursement decisions. The administrative committee had one member. I had seen her name on the document when I first opened the scan, and I had set it aside to read the disbursement clause first, because the disbursement clause was where the money was. But the name had stayed at the edge of my attention the way a sound stays in a room after the thing that made it has gone. The administrative committee's sole member was listed as Serena Bowie, financial coordinator. Not daughter-in-law, not family member. Financial coordinator. A title that appeared nowhere in the original charter, conferred by a document that had no legal standing, for a role that gave her joint authority with Gerald over every disbursement decision the foundation made. I looked at the scan again, at the revision date. March 15th. I thought about when Serena had first proposed bringing in Gerald as foundation director. It had been the previous February, 14 months before the amendment was filed. She had framed it as a practical suggestion. You shouldn't have to manage all the paperwork yourself, she had said. Gerald is experienced with these structures. It will run more smoothly with a professional involved. I had agreed. I had thought it was consideration. I looked at the total disbursements across 18 months. I looked at the gap between what had left the foundation and what had reached Daniel's university. I thought about Gerald's letter with its careful language, current operational guidelines, and the way that phrase now made a different kind of sense. He had not been describing something that existed when I signed the charter. He had been describing something he and Serena had built afterward, quietly, on paper, while I was burning incense and calling Daniel on Thursdays. 14 months of preparation, a hand-picked director, a title invented on a document I hadn't seen, an amendment filed while I wasn't looking. And $40,000 moved through it all like water through a channel they had dug together. I closed the folder. I sat very still. And then I remembered something Daniel had said on the phone, the thing I had marked in the margin without writing down. He had said the payments always came on time. He had said whatever Aunt Serena was doing with the administrative side of things, she was at least punctual. He had called her Aunt Serena, not his father's wife. Not his father's name. Aunt Serena. The name a child uses for someone who has made herself familiar, who has found reasons to be present, who has made herself the face of something that was never hers to administer. I wondered how many other conversations she had been having with my grandson that I did not know about. I wondered what else she had told him. I picked up my phone and opened the scan again, this time scrolling past the disbursement clause, past the administrative committee listing, past Gerald's signature at the bottom of page 4. There was a 5th page. I had not noticed it before. The scan was slightly misaligned at the edge, the page corner folded in the original document before it was fed through the machine. The header was partially cut off, but the body of the page was legible. It was a transfer authorization form, pre-signed. Gerald's signature at the bottom, and a second signature beside it. Beside Gerald's name was a line labeled Authorized Representative. The signature on that line was not Serena's. It was Philip's. I have always been an early riser. During my teaching years, I was at my desk by 5:30 every morning, lesson plans spread under the lamp while the rest of the house slept. Koa used to say I was the only person he knew who treated sunrise as a starting gun. I told him someone had to. He laughed and went back to sleep. Now I rise early for different reasons. The house is quietest before 6. The altar needs tending. And in recent weeks, the early hours had become working hours again, the way they were when I had 30 students depending on me to have thought clearly before they arrived. I had begun to think very clearly indeed. Arthur Kim had confirmed what I suspected. The fourth page of the amended document, the one filed with the state registry without my knowledge, without my signature, without any communication to me whatsoever, contained a revised disbursement clause. The new language replaced exclusively toward the direct educational expenses with a phrase so broad it could mean nearly anything. Educational and administrative expenses, reasonably related to the Foundation's mission and operations. Reasonably related. I had written 30 years of examination questions. I understood the difference between language that defines and language that permits. The original clause defined. The new clause permitted. It permitted, among other things, a director's consulting fee. It permitted operational overhead. It permitted, if one were so inclined, nearly any expense that could be loosely described as supporting the Foundation's work. Someone had been so inclined. Arthur filed a formal records request with the state registry on my behalf, citing my status as founding donor and named principal of the original charter. He was careful and methodical about it, the same way he had been when we first drew up the documents. He told me the registry would respond within 30 business days. He told me to say nothing to anyone in the meantime. I had no intention of saying anything to anyone. What I had instead was a plan. The kind that takes shape quietly, without announcement, built from small, deliberate actions the way a long proof is built, one step establishing the condition for the next. Nothing wasted, nothing premature. I started with the donors. There were 11 people who had contributed to the Foundation since its establishment. I had their names in my records because I had personally acknowledged every gift with a handwritten note, a habit from my teaching years when I believed that courtesy and precision were the same virtue expressed differently. I contacted 6 of them directly, framing my calls as routine stewardship outreach. I asked how they were. I mentioned Daniel's progress. And then, carefully, I asked whether they had received any recent communication from the Foundation. 3 of them had. The communications were not from me. They were signed by Gerald Tron, on Foundation letterhead, and they described the Foundation's expanded mission in warm and general terms. 2 of the letters had enclosed a request for additional donations. One had included a brief report on administrative improvements that had increased the Foundation's operational capacity. Operational capacity. I wrote that phrase in my notebook next to reasonably related. I asked each donor if they still had the letters. All 3 did. I asked if they would be willing to share copies with me for my records. All 3 said yes without hesitation. Former colleagues, former students, people who had given because they trusted me. The word trust sat in my chest like something with weight. I collected the letters. I added them to the blue folder, which had grown thicker and now required a new rubber band. Helen Wynne came for tea on a Friday afternoon, in the middle of all this. Helen had been principal at my school for the last 9 years of my teaching career, and before that a colleague in the mathematics department. We had known each other for 31 years. She was the kind of friend who did not require explanation, who could sit with you in a kitchen and understand the shape of a situation from the set of your shoulders before a word was spoken. I told her what I had found. Not everything, not the legal dimensions, but the human core of it, the numbers, the document, the 4th page that should not exist. She listened with her hands around her cup and her eyes on the table. Then she said, very quietly, that she had seen Serena at a charity luncheon in March. That Serena had spoken about the Foundation in a way Helen had found slightly strange at the time, using the word "our" in a context that seemed to claim more ownership than made sense. Our Foundation's approach. Our operational model. Helen had assumed it was careless language. She mentioned it now because, in light of what I had just described, careless seemed less likely than intentional. I wrote "our" in the notebook. I thanked her. I told her there was nothing she needed to do. She gave me the look she used to give students who tried to turn in incomplete work. She said she still had every email she'd received from the Foundation going back 2 years, and that her inbox was well organized, and I was welcome to any of it. I said I might take her up on that. I might, as it happened, take her up on considerably more than that. After Helen left, I sat at the desk in the back room, the one facing the window, and looked out at the late afternoon street. A woman walked past with 2 children. A man on a motorbike slowed to let a dog cross. The ordinary motions of an ordinary neighborhood, indifferent to what was happening inside this house. Koa used to say that still water gives no warning before it moves. I had been thinking about that phrase since chapter 1. Since the night of the family meeting when I first said it to myself in this same room. But I understood it differently now. It was not only about patience, it was about accumulation. Still, water is not inactive. It is filling, slowly, quietly, below the surface, building pressure that no one thinks to measure because nothing visible is happening. Serena had looked at me and seen a retired school teacher who did not understand foundations. She had not thought to measure what was filling below. The call from Arthur's office came on a Monday, 3 weeks after we had filed the records request. His assistant had received the initial response from the state registry, a preliminary document log listing what was on file under the foundation's registration number. Among the items listed was a board resolution dated 14 months ago, authorizing the director to execute disbursements under the revised operational guidelines without requiring founding donor approval for individual transactions. A board resolution. The foundation had one board member, Gerald Tran. He had passed a resolution authorizing himself. The letter arrived on a Monday. It was printed on new foundation letterhead different again from the version Gerald had used. This one with a formal seal I did not recognize, and a revised address listing a commercial office space in the business district downtown. Someone had been busy. Someone had been making things look permanent. The letter was from Serena, not from Gerald. Not from Linda Fitzgerald, the lawyer whose name had begun appearing on foundation correspondence in recent weeks. From Serena directly, in her own name, under the title she had given herself on the amended charter, Financial Coordinator. The title sat beneath her name like something she had always been entitled to, like a credential she had earned rather than assigned to herself on a document filed without my knowledge. The letter informed me that following a review of the foundation's operational structure, the board had voted to consolidate administrative functions and reduce external communications to a single point of contact. All future donor inquiries should be directed to the foundation's administrative office. Direct contact with banking institutions, the state registry, or legal representatives of the foundation by parties other than authorized personnel would be considered interference with foundation operations and handled accordingly. Handled accordingly. I read the phrase twice. Then I read the part about the board. The foundation's original charter specified no board. There was a founding donor, a director, and an advisory structure that had never been formally convened because there had never been a need. The amended charter, the one Gerald had filed without my consent, had introduced a board of directors, 3 members, Gerald Tran, Serena Bowie, and a third name I had not seen before, a man named Vincent Dow, listed in Arthur's subsequent research as a business associate of Gerald's from his previous nonprofit work. 3 members, none of them appointed by me, all of them voting on a foundation that existed because I had funded it. I set the letter on the kitchen table and went to make tea. I moved slowly. I was aware of moving slowly, of making the deliberate choice not to rush, not to let the letter set the tempo of my morning. This was still my kitchen. This was still my house. The altar was still in the hallway. The photograph of Koa was still where I had placed it, and the incense was still burning, and outside the window the vendor with the banh mi cart was still making his same call in the same rhythm he had used for 15 years. Some things remained exactly as they were. I drank my tea, then I called Arthur. He had already received a copy of the letter, forwarded from his office address where he had registered himself as my legal representative. He read me the relevant statutes while I listened and watched a gecko move along the upper corner of my kitchen wall, unhurried, certain of its footing. The letter was a pressure tactic, Arthur said, legally hollow. My rights as founding donor were established in the original charter, and the original charter remained the governing document regardless of what had been filed subsequently, pending the outcome of the challenge he was preparing. They could not legally prevent me from contacting the state registry. They could not legally prevent me from requesting records. The language about handling things accordingly was designed to sound like authority. It was not. I thanked him. I told him to proceed. What I did not tell Arthur, because it was not relevant to the legal work, and because I was still turning it over in my own mind, was what had happened the previous Friday. Philip had come to the house, not with Serena. Alone, which was uncommon enough that I noticed it before I had even opened the door fully. He stood on the step in the late afternoon light, looking like a man who had rehearsed something and was already uncertain of his lines. He came inside. He sat in the chair across from Koa's. He did not look at the altar. He said that Serena had explained the situation to him, and he wanted me to understand that the foundation was being managed professionally now, and that my concerns, while he appreciated them, were based on a misunderstanding of how modern nonprofit structures operated. He said the amendment had been a necessary update. He said Gerald was experienced and trustworthy. He said Serena had put considerable time and effort into making the foundation more efficient, and that it was not fair to characterize her work as anything other than what it was. What it was? I looked at my son, and I thought about the transfer authorization form on the 5th page of the scan, the one with his signature beside Gerald's on the line marked Authorized Representative. I had not told him I had seen it. Arthur had advised me to say nothing about the specific evidence until the formal challenge was filed. I had agreed. So, I sat and I listened to Philip explain my own foundation to me. And I kept my face still and my voice even, and I said I understood his perspective, and I would think carefully about what he had said. He looked relieved. He should not have. 3 days after the letter arrived, Serena appeared at my door unannounced. This was something she had never done before. She had always called ahead, always framed her visits around a shared meal or a family occasion. She had always, until now, maintained the appearance of courtesy. She was not maintaining it today. She came inside without being invited, moved through the front room into the living room, and sat down without being asked. She was wearing the cream blazer again. She had a folder under her arm. She placed the folder on the table between us. Inside were transfer authorization forms. 3 of them, pre-prepared, requiring my signature to release a new set of disbursements from the foundation's primary account. The amounts were larger than anything previously documented. The payee lines listed Gerald's consulting firm and an account I did not recognize. She said, very pleasantly, "Mrs. Bowie, I think it's time we simplified this process. You sign these today, and we close the loop on the current quarter. No more letters, no more back and forth, no more involving outside parties in what is really just a family matter." Outside parties. Arthur Kim, who had helped me build the foundation from the ground up, was now an outside party. I looked at the forms. I looked at the amounts. I looked at her face, which held the expression of someone who believes the outcome is already settled, who is offering a choice as a formality only, because the real decision has already been made somewhere she controls. She leaned forward slightly, and her voice dropped to something almost gentle. She said, "You're 70 years old. You've done something wonderful with this foundation. But managing a financial structure like this takes expertise you don't have." Philip agrees. Gerald agrees. "You can trust us to handle it correctly. All you have to do is sign." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I looked down at the forms. The kitchen was quiet. The incense from the hallway reached us, thin and steady. Somewhere outside a door closed. A motorbike started. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary day in a house where something was very close to breaking open. I folded my hands on the table in front of me and did not reach for the pen. And Serena, who had never once considered that I might not sign, finally looked at me as though she was seeing something she had not prepared for. Arthur called on a Tuesday morning in late June. I was at the kitchen table with my tea and my notebook, the way I always was at that hour. The altar incense had just been lit. The smoke was still finding its direction, curling upward in the still air, slow and unhurried, the way smoke moves when nothing disturbs it. I knew from the way Arthur said my name that what he had found was not small. He had received the complete document package from the state registry. He had also, through a contact at the city's nonprofit oversight office, obtained the foundation's full banking history, every transaction, every payee, every transfer, going back to the day the account was opened. This was within my rights as founding donor. I had signed the authorization 3 weeks earlier without asking what he expected to find. I had not wanted to know what he expected. I had wanted to know what was true. He read me the figures slowly, the way I used to read examination results to students who already knew they had failed, not to prolong the pain but because accuracy requires time, and time cannot be hurried. $41,230. That was the total. I had estimated $40,000 in my notebook, working from incomplete data. The quarterly statements I had been able to piece together. Arthur's number was precise. $41,230, dispersed over 22 months in transactions, categorized as consulting fees, administrative overhead, and operational development, none of which had documentation attached, none of which had been approved by me, all of which had been authorized by a board resolution signed by the sole board member who had also been the recipient of a significant portion of the funds. I wrote the number in my notebook. I drew a line under it. Then Arthur told me the rest. The consulting fees had not gone to an outside firm. They had not gone to any professional service provider with a verifiable address and a business license. They had gone, in 11 separate transfers over 22 months, to a single personal account. The account belonged to Serena, not to a company Serena owned, not to any entity with the foundation's name attached. To Serena directly. Her personal account, the one linked to the household she shared with my son. I did not speak for a moment. The incense smoke had settled into its vertical line, rising straight now, undisturbed. Through the doorway, I could see Koa's photograph on the altar, the one where he is laughing, looking at something off-screen, something worth looking at. The morning light had not yet reached that end of the hallway. His face was in the softer, dimmer light of early day. I thought about the year Philip and Serena married. The wedding had been in the spring, a Saturday, and Serena had worn a dress that her mother had helped her choose. I remembered thinking she looked genuinely happy that day, not performed happy, not strategic happy, but the real kind, the kind that is difficult to manufacture. I had thought, watching them, that she would be good for him, that she would add something to the family that we had been missing since Koa died. I had been wrong in the particular way that hurts most, which is not the way of complete misjudgment, but the way of a quality that was real, and then became something else. She had been that person once. Somewhere between then and now, she had made a series of choices, each one small enough to rationalize, each one building on the last, until the accumulation of them had produced this $41,000. 11 transfers. Her name on the receiving end of every one. Arthur's voice continued. He said the amended document, the 4-page version filed with the state registry, bore a signature on the final page. A signature in my name. My name. My hand tightened on the phone. I asked him to say that again. He did. The signature on the amended foundation charter, the one that had expanded the disbursement language and removed the founding donor approval requirement, was signed with my name, not my signature. I am a mathematics teacher. I have looked at enough student work to understand the difference between a thing and an imitation of a thing. Arthur had obtained a copy of the filed document and compared it against the original charter, which I had sent him weeks earlier. The signatures did not match. The letters were approximate. The proportion was close enough to pass a casual inspection, but the pressure pattern was wrong. The habit of my hand in the downstroke of the B and buoy, a particular angle I had never consciously noticed until I saw something pretending to be it and found the pretense insufficient. Someone had signed my name to a document I had never seen and filed it with the state. I set the phone down on the table, not hanging up, just setting it down, and pressed both hands flat against the surface the way I used to press them against the blackboard when I needed a moment to collect myself in front of 30 students waiting for me to continue. The kitchen was very quiet. The incense burned. Outside, someone was watering a garden, the sound of water on leaves coming through the window screen, cool and ordinary, entirely indifferent. I thought about Serena at the family meeting. The way she had slid that paper across the table toward me. Sign where I tell you. Patient. Certain. The amendment she had wanted me to sign that day had not been the beginning of the plan. It had been an attempt to legitimize what had already happened. She had needed my real signature to replace the forged one, to clean the record, to close the gap between what she had filed and what I might eventually find. She had not gotten it, and she had not known, sitting in that living room with her highlighted pen and her neighborhood witnesses, that I had already begun to understand why she wanted it. I picked up the phone. Arthur was still there. I asked him 2 questions. The first was whether a forged signature on a state-filed document constituted fraud. He said yes. The second was whether the email chain between Serena and Gerald, which Helen had forwarded to me the previous week and which I had already sent to Arthur, was sufficient to demonstrate premeditation. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said it was sufficient for considerably more than that. I thanked him. I told him I would come to his office on Thursday. I told him to have everything organized by then, every document, every transfer record, every comparison of the two signatures, everything in order and ready to be presented. He said he would. I ended the call and sat in the kitchen for a long time after, not crying. I have not cried since the morning Koa died, not because grief has left me, but because it changed form. It became something I carry rather than something that falls. What I felt that morning in the kitchen was not grief exactly. It was the sensation of a proof reaching its final line. The long column of work, the careful steps, each one placed correctly, and then the last number, the one that confirms what the structure of the problem had been telling you all along. The answer had always been there. I had simply needed to show all my work to make it undeniable. I have spent my life doing things in a particular order. 30 years of teaching will do that to a person. You learn early that the sequence matters as much as the content, that a student who sees the answer before understanding the method will never truly understand either. You work the problem from the beginning. You show every step. You do not skip to the conclusion simply because you already know what it is. I applied this principle to what came next. The morning after Serena left my house with her unsigned forms, I was at my desk by 6 o'clock. The city was not yet fully awake. The altar candle had burned down to a stub overnight, and I replaced it before I sat down. A small ritual I did not skip even on mornings when other things were pressing. Hoa's photograph looked the same as it always did. He was still laughing at something just outside the frame. I opened my green notebook to a clean page and drew a line down the center. On the left side I wrote, "What they have." On the right side I wrote, "What I have." I worked the left side first, because a mathematics teacher always examines the opposing argument before defending her own. What did Serena and Gerald have? They had the amended charter on file with the state registry, the one Gerald had submitted without my consent. They had 3 names on a board I had never convened. They had 18 months of disbursements that, under the fraudulent amendment, could be described as authorized. They had Philip's signature on a transfer authorization form, which meant they had, or believed they had, a version of family consensus. They had a lawyer named Linda Fitzgerald, whose letters had become more frequent and more formal in tone over the past 2 weeks. They had the assumption, built over 18 months, that I would not look closely enough to find the discrepancy. That assumption had already failed, but they did not know that yet. I moved to the right side. I had the original charter, notarized, dated, filed with Arthur Kim, and with a copy in my blue folder. The language was unambiguous. I had written it to be unambiguous. I had the 18 months of bank statements showing disbursements categorized as operational expenses that exceeded Daniel's actual tuition by $40,000. I had Daniel's university invoices, provided by Daniel himself without any awareness of why I had asked, confirming exactly what had been paid to the institution and when. I had Gerald's letter with its careful reference to current operational guidelines, which was itself evidence that he had known the original charter did not support what he was doing. I had Arthur's research confirming that the filed amendment required my written consent, which had never been obtained, making the document legally invalid. I had the 5th page of the scan, the transfer authorization with Philip's signature, which I had not yet decided how to use. And I had one more thing, which I had not written down anywhere. I had a meeting scheduled for the following Thursday. Arthur had filed the formal legal challenge to the amendment 3 days earlier. The state registry had flagged it for review. A mandatory mediation session had been required before any further action, a standard procedural step in nonprofit charter disputes. Arthur had been notified that all parties included Gerald Tran. It included the Foundation's Board of Record, which meant Serena and Vincent Dow. It included, by extension, any authorized representatives. It did not include Philip, who had signed a transfer authorization form, but had no official standing in the Foundation's governance structure. His signature on that form was significant for other reasons Arthur and I had discussed carefully and were holding in reserve. The mediation was scheduled for 10 in the morning at the offices of a state-appointed neutral, a woman named Commissioner Fawn, who handled nonprofit disputes for the regional administrative body. Arthur had met with her before. He described her as precise and unsentimental, the kind of official who reads original documents before listening to explanations of what they mean. I appreciated that quality in a person. The week before the mediation, I organized everything. I worked at the kitchen table in the evenings after dinner, the overhead light bright, a pot of tea at my elbow. I did not rush. Rushing is what produces errors, and errors in the presentation of evidence are the things Serena would be looking for. The thread she would pull to unravel the whole. I would not give her a thread. I sorted the bank statements chronologically and tabulated the disbursements by category in a format that any person, not just a financial professional, could follow at a glance. I prepared a comparison table. Original charter language in one column, amended charter language in the second column, the legal statute requiring donor consent in the third. I printed Daniel's university invoices in order of date and attached them to the corresponding quarterly statements, so the comparison was immediate and self-evident. I compiled Arthur's legal correspondence into a single exhibit binder with numbered tabs. The transfer authorization form, with Philip's signature, I placed in a separate envelope. Arthur would decide when and how that entered the record. I also prepared something that had not been Arthur's idea. I had been in contact, over the previous 2 weeks, with the 2 donors who had contributed to the foundation in the quarter, whose statement had arrived at my house by accident. The retired teachers, I had called them both, carefully, explaining only that I was reviewing the foundation's records and wanted to confirm the intent of their gifts. Both had responded in writing at my request. Both letters said the same thing in different words. The money was given for Daniel's education, for nothing else. They had understood that to be the purpose of the foundation when they contributed, and it remained their understanding. Donor intent is not a trivial consideration in nonprofit law, Arthur had told me. When donors specify a purpose, that purpose has legal weight. A foundation that diverts restricted gifts to other uses exposes itself and its directors to liability that goes beyond the administrative. It can reach into the personal. I had placed both letters in the exhibit binder, behind tab 7. The night before the mediation, I sat at the altar for a long time after the evening incense was lit. The flame was small and steady. Hoa's photograph was the same as always. I did not speak out loud. I rarely do, but I sat there long enough that the incense burned most of the way down, and the night outside the window went fully dark, and the sounds of the street gradually quieted into the particular silence that comes after midnight. I thought about Serena in my living room with her forms and her pleasant voice and her certainty that I would sign because there was no other reasonable outcome, because she had arranged everything so carefully, because she believed she had seen the full shape of the board before her and known exactly how it would fall. She had not seen the full board. I went to bed at a reasonable hour, because a mathematics teacher who has checked her work 3 times knows that staying awake past midnight serves no purpose. Either the numbers are right, or they are not, and I knew mine were right. In the morning, I would sit across a table from the people who had taken $40,000 from a fund built for my grandson and tell them, without raising my voice, that I had known for quite some time, and I would let the documents do the rest. The folder was packed, the binder was tabbed, the tea would be ready by 7. Everything was in order. The storm I had been preparing had a name now, and a date, and I was the only one in the room who knew it was coming. The meeting room at Arthur Kim's office was on the 4th floor of a building that overlooked a small courtyard with a single tree growing in it. A tamarind, old and unhurried, its branches spread wide without asking anyone's permission. I arrived at 8:40, 20 minutes early. I had pressed my best dye the night before. The deep indigo one I wore for school ceremonies and formal occasions. The one Koa had said made me look like someone who had already made up her mind. I brought the blue folder. I brought my green notebook. I brought nothing else. Arthur had arranged the room carefully. One long table, chairs on both sides, a projector connected to his laptop, water glasses already filled. He had placed my chair at the head. I sat down and set the blue folder in front of me and folded my hands on top of it. By 9 o'clock, they were all present. Serena arrived with a lawyer I had not seen before, a young man in a dark suit who carried himself with the confidence of someone who had not yet lost enough cases to know what losing felt like. Gerald Tran came separately, nodding at no one, taking the seat farthest from the door. Philip arrived last, alone, his face doing the thing it had been doing for weeks, that particular stillness that meant he was managing something too large to show. The representative from the State Attorney General's Charitable Trust Division sat to Arthur's left. Her name was Miss Fuang, and she had brought her own folder, thicker than mine. and a second colleague who operated a laptop with quiet efficiency. They had been the ones to confirm, through official channels, what Arthur had found privately. They were not here as observers. They were here because this had become, officially, their concern as much as mine. Helen Wynne sat against the wall, not at the table. She had come as a witness. She had also, I knew, brought printed copies of every email she had received from the Foundation over the past 2 years, organized by date, annotated in her meticulous retired principal handwriting. Serena looked at me when she sat down. A quick look, the kind meant to assess rather than greet. I met it without expression and then looked at my folder. Arthur opened the meeting. He was methodical. He had always been methodical. He began with the original charter, projected on the wall, and read the disbursement clause in full, exclusively toward the direct educational expenses of the designated beneficiary. He let the language sit in the room for a moment before moving to the next document. The amended charter appeared on the screen beside it, the revised clause, educational and administrative expenses reasonably related to the Foundation's mission and operations. Then Arthur placed 2 documents side by side on the projected screen. The signature on the original charter, on the left. The signature on the amended filing, on the right. He did not explain them at length. He simply said, for the record, that a forensic document examiner had reviewed both signatures and provided a written opinion, which was included in the evidence package already submitted to Miss Prov and at ETIN, Phuong's office. The opinion stated that the signature on the amended charter was not consistent with the signature of the founding donor. Serena's lawyer started to speak. Arthur raised one hand, not aggressively, simply indicating that he had not finished. He then displayed the bank transfer records. 11 transactions. Dates, amounts, receiving account number. He read them aloud, each one, the way I used to read student scores at the end of a term, steadily, without emphasis, letting the numbers carry their own weight. The total, he said, was $41,230. He displayed the account records, showing where the money had gone. The room was extremely quiet. Then Arthur did the last thing, the thing I had asked him to do specifically, the thing I had thought about since the morning in the kitchen when I pressed my hands flat on the table and looked at Koa's photograph and understood what had happened. He read aloud from the email chain between Serena and Gerald. The earliest email in the chain was dated 26 months ago. In it, Serena described the Foundation's current structure as unnecessarily restrictive and proposed what she called a more flexible operational model. Gerald responded the following day. His response included the phrase, "The donor doesn't need to be involved in day-to-day decisions at this stage." The donor. Not my name. Not Mrs. Bowie. Not Daniel's grandmother. The donor. As though I were a source of funds rather than a person. As though my only relevant function had been to fill the account. Arthur paused after reading that line and looked at Serena. She was looking at the table. I opened my blue folder. I did not stand. I did not raise my voice. I had not raised my voice in 30 years of teaching. Not once. Because I had learned early that a quiet voice in a quiet room carries farther than shouting. I removed the original Foundation charter, my copy, the one with the real rubber band mark still visible from where the old band had snapped. I placed it on the table in front of me. Then I spoke directly to the room, not to Serena specifically, to everyone. I said, I established this foundation in 2019, using savings accumulated over 40 years of teaching mathematics. Every condition attached to those funds was written by me, reviewed by me, and signed by me, with a clear and specific intent. I am a retired school teacher. I taught children how to think rigorously and how to show their work. I have been showing my work for the past 4 months. I looked then at Serena. I said, "You told me, in front of witnesses, that I did not understand how foundations work. That I should sign where you told me and let the adults handle the money." He sat me hand on the folder. I said, "I founded this account. I wrote its governing documents. I identified and corrected a forged amendment. I traced $41,000 to its destination. I compiled 6 months of evidence and presented it to the state authority with jurisdiction over charitable fraud." I folded my hands again. I said, "I understand exactly how foundations work." Serena's lawyer put his hand on her arm. She did not move. Her face had gone the color of old paper. Not white exactly, but drained. The way a surface looks when something has been removed from it. Gerald Tran had not looked up from the table since the transfer records appeared on the screen. Miss Fwang set down her pen and addressed both of them directly. She explained, in the measured language of someone who has done this before, that the Charitable Trust Division had opened a formal investigation, that the individuals present would be contacted through proper channels regarding next steps. That cooperation at this stage was noted and considered, that the absence of cooperation was also noted and considered. Philip sat very still through all of this. When Miss Fwang finished, he turned to look at his wife. He asked her one question. 4 words, the same 4 words I had known he would eventually ask. The ones that could not be taken back once spoken. He said, "Did you do this?" Serena looked at her lawyer. Her lawyer said nothing. The tamarind tree in the courtyard below was perfectly still. The commissioner called a recess at 11:45. She said she needed 30 minutes to review supplementary materials. What she meant was that she had read tab 7, the donor letters, and needed time to reconcile what they said with the disbursement records Gerald had submitted as his own exhibit, which categorized $40,000 in transfers as foundational educational support without a single receipt attached. Arthur and I stepped into the hallway. It was a plain hallway. Government building. Institutional lighting. The kind of fluorescent that flattens everything to the same pale gray. A water cooler hummed at the far end. 2 plastic chairs sat against the wall. I took one. Arthur stood, which was his habit when he was thinking. He said, "She's going to rule against the amendment." I said I had expected that. He said, "Gerald may face personal liability. The self-dealing with the consulting fees, the unauthorized filing, the donor intent violation, these are not administrative oversights. They're actionable." I said I had expected that too. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "You're very calm." I told him I had been a mathematics teacher for 30 years. When the numbers are right, there is nothing to be anxious about. He almost smiled. We went back inside when the commissioner reconvened. The room had shifted in texture during the recess. Something in the air had changed, the way air changes before weather moves in. Gerald sat very still. He had been still since tab 4. Since the moment Arthur had placed the original charter beside the amended version and invited Commissioner Fan to compare the disbursement clauses side by side. Gerald had looked at those 2 documents the way a student looks at a failed examination, with the particular stillness of someone who has run out of alternate explanations. Serena had not gone still. She had moved in the opposite direction. During the recess she had spoken in low, urgent tones to Linda Fitzgerald, her head bent close, her hands making small, controlled gestures. Whatever she had said, Linda's response had been brief and not visibly encouraging. Serena had straightened in her chair and smoothed the front of her blazer and composed her face back into its professional surface. But the surface was thinner now. I could see through it. Commissioner Fan returned to her notes. She began with the amendment. The filing by Director Tran of an amended governing charter altering the disbursement terms of the foundation without the written consent of the founding donor, as expressly required by the original charter's donor rights clause, constitutes an unauthorized act. The amendment is hereby deemed invalid, and the original charter is restored as the sole governing document of the Bowie Family Education Foundation. Linda Fitzgerald raised a procedural objection. Commissioner Fan noted it without looking up and moved on. She turned to the disbursements. A review of the Foundation's financial records against the original charter's disbursement terms reveals expenditures totaling approximately 42 million dong, classified as administrative and operational expenses, made over an 18-month period. These disbursements were not authorized under the original charter, which permits only direct educational payments to the designated beneficiary. Additionally, payment records show that Director Tran's private consulting firm received recurring monthly transfers from Foundation accounts during this same period, representing a clear conflict of interest and potential self-dealing in violation of nonprofit fiduciary standards. Gerald moved for the first time since the recess. A small movement, just his right hand pressing flat against the table, as though steadying himself. The commissioner continued. The founding donors exhibit also includes letters from 2 contributing donors confirming that their gifts were made with the specific and exclusive intent of funding the designated beneficiary's direct educational costs. Diversion of restricted gifts to general or administrative purposes constitutes a breach of donor intent with potential criminal referral implications under applicable nonprofit law. Criminal referral. Those 2 words sat in the room like objects placed on a table. Linda Fitzgerald leaned close to Serena and said something very quietly. Serena did not respond. She was looking at the table in front of her, at her own hands, at nothing in particular. Then Gerald spoke. I did not expect it. Arthur did not expect it. Even Commissioner Fawn looked up from her notes with the expression of someone recalibrating. Gerald said, "The financial coordinator directed the disbursements." The room went very quiet. He said it again, more clearly, because the first time had come out slightly compressed, the words pressed together by whatever was happening in his chest. The financial coordinator, Serena Bui. She directed the disbursements. She provided the payee accounts. She told me the amendment would cover the operational classifications. I filed what she prepared. The consulting payments were her arrangement. The account they went to, that account is hers. Serena turned to look at him. I have taught long enough to recognize the moment a student realizes they have copied the wrong answer from someone who did not know the right one. It is a specific expression, disbelief first, then the rapid recalculation, then the thing that comes after recalculation when the new number is worse than the original. Serena said. That is not true. Gerald said. I have the email chain. The room changed again. Linda Fitzgerald placed one hand on Serena's arm, a restraining gesture more than a comforting one. Gerald reached into his briefcase and produced a folder. He had come prepared for this moment. He had perhaps been preparing for it since the formal challenge was filed, since he understood that the procedural walls were closing, and the question was no longer whether accountability would arrive but whose name would be on it when it did. Commissioner Fawn accepted the folder. She read in silence for what felt like a long time. Arthur stood very straight beside me. Across the table, Linda whispered something to Serena in tones too low to hear. Serena did not respond. She was watching Gerald with the expression of someone watching something that cannot be stopped. The email chain, as the commissioner summarized it later for the record, contained 37 messages between Gerald Tran and Serena Bui spanning 14 months. In those messages, Serena had specified payee accounts for each operational disbursement. She had directed the classification language used in the amended charter. She had confirmed the monthly consulting transfers to Gerald's firm, which the emails made clear were a fee for his cooperation and silence rather than any genuine professional service. She had used the phrase "cover it under admin" at least 6 times. Cover it under admin. Commissioner Fan set the folder down. She looked at Serena. Serena said nothing. For the first time in my experience of her, she had nothing to say. The blazer could not help her here. The pleasant voice had nowhere to go. She had walked into this room believing she was the most capable person in it, and she had been correct. Technically, she was the most capable person at deception, at arrangement, at the architecture of a scheme built to look administrative from the outside, while hiding something else entirely within. But she had made the same mistake that capable people sometimes make. She had assumed that being capable of building something meant she was safe inside it. She had not considered what would happen when the person she had built it with decided the structure was no longer protecting him. Commissioner Fan announced that the mediation would be suspended, and the matter referred to the State Attorney General's Charitable Trust Division for full investigation. She looked at Gerald. She looked at Serena. She said, "You will both want legal representation beyond what is currently present in this room." I sat very still. I thought about a Tuesday in October, the family meeting arranged like a classroom, Serena sliding a paper across the table with her highlighted pen and her patient voice that was not patient. "Sign where I tell you, and let the adults handle the money." I had not signed, and now the adults had handled the money, and Commissioner Fan had the emails, and the room was finally, completely, showing everyone in it exactly what it contained. The restitution order came through on a Thursday morning in September. I was at my desk, the one facing the window, the one Koa had turned for me in the last year of his life, so that I would stop looking at walls. The light was coming in at the angle it only reaches in early autumn, low and golden, the kind that makes ordinary things look considered, a cup of tea. The blue folder, thinner now that Arthur had filed its contents with the appropriate offices. My green notebook, open to the last page of calculations I would need to make for this particular matter. Arthur called at 9:15. He read me the terms in full, as I had asked him to. The way I had always asked him to do things completely, without summary, without the softening that comes from someone deciding in advance what you need to hear. Serena and Gerald Tran were ordered to make full restitution to the foundation, $41,230, plus investigative costs, plus interest calculated from the date of the first unauthorized transfer. Gerald had surrendered his director's certification and was barred from serving in any fiduciary capacity for nonprofit organizations in the state for a period of 7 years. Serena faced a separate civil judgment. The criminal referral remained active. Her lawyer had advised her to cooperate fully, which she had, in the end, done. The foundation account, restored to its proper balance, sat waiting. I thanked Arthur. I told him his work had been exact and I was grateful for it. He said, in his quiet way, that it had been an unusual case, and that he meant that as the highest compliment he knew how to give. I set the phone down and looked out the window for a while. The street was doing what streets do in the morning. A woman walked past with groceries. 2 men stood talking at the corner. One gesturing, one listening. A child on a bicycle wobbled past the gate and straightened and kept going. Nobody out there knew that inside this house, something had been set right. The world does not pause for private justice. It simply continues, and you continue inside it, carrying whatever has changed. Daniel came to see me that Saturday. He arrived at noon with banh mi from the shop near his university, the one he had been going to since his first week of classes, and a sheaf of drawings rolled under his arm. He had heard the basic outline of what had happened through Philip, who had told him only as much as was necessary and had done so, from what I understood, with considerable difficulty. Daniel set the drawings on the kitchen table before he said anything else. He unrolled them slowly, weighing the corners with the salt dish and the sugar bowl and my teacup and his own. They were the plans for his final year thesis project, a community library designed for a narrow urban site, the kind of building that had to do several things at once without looking as though it were trying. He had been working on it for 8 months. He walked me through it the way he always walked me through his work. From the outside in, starting with the site and moving through the entry sequence and into the reading rooms, each space considered, each proportion defended with reasons that were his own. He had thought about light the way I had taught him to think about proofs, from first principles, with nothing assumed. I asked questions. He answered them. We talked for 2 hours about the building, about what he wanted it to do, about the difference between a structure that serves its users and one that merely contains them. At some point, the banh mi was eaten, and the tea was refreshed, and the afternoon light had shifted to the lower, warmer register of mid-September. Then Daniel said, without looking up from the drawings, "Grandmother, I want you to know that I knew the money was yours. I always knew it. I never thought of it as anything else." I looked at him. He said, "I want to do something with it that's worth what you put into it." I told him the fund had been restored. I told him it would cover his remaining tuition and his materials for the thesis year and whatever else he needed to finish well. I told him that was what it had always been for, and that nothing about that had changed. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he sometimes went quiet, the way his father went quiet, going somewhere interior, to look at something before speaking again. Then he said, "Do you think I should become an architect who teaches?" I told him I thought he should become whatever kind of architect he was going to be, but yes, I thought he might be good at teaching. He smiled. It was Koa's smile, the one that arrived sideways, starting at the corners and moving inward, the kind that looks like it was surprised to find itself on someone's face. After he left, I went to the altar. The incense had burned out sometime in the afternoon without my noticing. I lit a new stick, held it for a moment in both hands the way I always did, and set it in the holder in front of Koa's photograph. The smoke rose in a thin line, straight and unhurried. I looked at his face. The sideways smile, caught by someone with a camera at a moment he wasn't expecting it. I thought about what Helen had said in my kitchen, months ago now, when I had first begun to understand what Serena had done. Helen had asked what I was going to do, I had said I was not sure yet. What I had been was waiting. Not from fear, and not from confusion. From the same reason you wait in mathematics when a proof is not yet complete, because an answer presented before all the steps are shown is not an answer, it is only an assertion, and assertions can be refuted by anyone with sufficient confidence, regardless of whether they are true. I had shown all my steps. The proof was complete. And now the fund was restored, and Daniel would finish his building. And somewhere in the city, Serena and Gerald were learning the particular lesson that only consequences can teach, the one that no classroom and no family and no amount of patient explanation can deliver as precisely as accountability. I was not richer than I had been in October when Serena slid that paper across the table with her highlighted pen and her patient voice. I was not poorer than I had been before she began. What I had recovered was not money, exactly, though the money was part of it. What I had recovered was the thing Koa had built the desk to face the window for. The sense of continuing in the direction you have always been moving, without being turned, without being diminished, without letting someone else's certainty substitute for your own. I stood at the altar until the incense found its direction. Then I went back to the desk, opened my green notebook to a clean page, and drew a single line down the center. Koa used to say that still water gives no warning before it moves. He was right about that. But what he did not say, what I had spent this year learning, was what the water carries when it finally does. If anyone has ever looked at you and assumed you wouldn't notice, wouldn't remember, wouldn't act, this story is for you. Getting older doesn't make you invisible. It makes you patient. And patient people, when the moment finally comes, don't need to raise their voice. They just open the folder. If Miriam's story stayed with you, please give this video a like and subscribe so you never miss the next one. These stories exist because people like you keep showing up for them. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. When someone underestimates you, do you say something right away, or do you wait and let the truth speak for itself?